All right. So, like Hannah mentioned, I'm Catherine. I'm a dietitian working at Somerset West Community Health Center. And Hannah asked me today to kind of create a little workshop that would cover the feeding principles and just some general recommendations on what to feed your children. And so I thought we would cover the what, when, and where. And as I'll kind of explain, this should be the parent responsibility. So I think it'll help to answer a lot of questions that parents may have around feeding their children, whether they're kind of infants up to, older children up to even 6 or 8 or even 12 years old. So, as I mentioned, I kind of went off the division of responsibility. So it's kind of a theory or principle of feeding that was developed by Ellen Satter. And so it divides responsibility around feeding in two. So for the parent and or caregiver and for the children. So the parent should be responsible for what, when, and where foods are being offered. And that's what we'll focus on today. I think it'll help address, like I said, a lot of questions that parents may have around that. And then the child's responsibility is to figure out how much and whether they eat or not. So they can choose not to have the meal that's being offered, and they can choose how much. So we shouldn't, as parents or caregivers, worry too much about the amount that we're offering, but rather about what we're offering, kind of what, when, so the meal and snack times, and then where we're offering those. And of course, if you have questions throughout, let me know, or you can always type them in the chat box too, just so we can address them at the end. And so if we get into the what, like what we should be offering, here are a few little tips and things to keep in mind. So we should be offering modified family meals. And what that means is we shouldn't be making a separate meal for the child. Of course, from when we start introducing solids, it might be very different. It might be similar foods, but we might just start with one food at a time. But as the child gets older and reaches about 1 year old, they should pretty much be eating whatever the family's eating for, breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe modified in terms of texture. And we know there's a risk of choking between 0 to 4 years old with certain foods. So the importance of modifying it in that way as well. So like if you're offering grapes, maybe cut them all smaller, if you're offering certain vegetables. But apart from that, just offer whatever your meal is for the family. Trying different forms of food. So if your child may be refusing a certain food like a vegetable, and you've tried maybe multiple times, obviously it's important to continue trying. It can take up to 10 times sometimes before the child accepts it, and to try offering it in different ways. So maybe you could offer it cooked or raw, or make some fun shapes on the plate, or add it to a smoothie, and that can help increase your chances of your child accepting it. Obviously aiming for some variety, and we'll talk about what the plate should look like, and when you're offering food, what you might want to aim for, but trying all types of vegetables, all types of protein, whether it's meat or fish. Obviously focusing on what your family has, but try not to stick to just what your child likes, but rather just trying a bunch of different foods. And in terms of beverages, what to offer would be mainly water and milk. And if you're offering milk, usually from I guess 9 months is when you would want to start introducing it. Between 9 and 12 months, up to 2 years, you'd want to go high fat. And then starting at 2 years old, you can offer whatever milk, including maybe 1 or 2%. The rest should be water, and you want to limit juice. So trying not to offer it at all or very infrequently, because we found that juice is associated with tooth decay, malnutrition, some digestion symptoms, lack of calcium in the diet. So we want to just stick to water and milk, and try to avoid added sugar or salt in foods, especially for young children under the age of 1, trying to avoid salt, aiming for kind of healthy foods. And then a special attention to honey, fish, and milk, depending on the age of your child. So honey, we want to be careful and introduce it later. I believe it's after 2 years old, 1 or 2, being careful with fish because of the mercury content. So there's a good resource from Ottawa Public Health that maybe I can share with Hannah as well on which fish have more or less mercury and how often to offer them. And milk, as I mentioned, we want to start introducing only at 9 to 12 months, and then continue. And we can offer up to about 2 cups per day, starting at 1 year old. Any questions so far? Yep.
No question.
No questions. Okay, got it.
Yeah, just
okay, so if we look at, sounds good.
All right.
So if we continue with kind of what to offer, what a meal should look like is basically based on the Canada's Food Guide. So that would go for children and adults, but of course, as I mentioned, the texture might be modified a little bit depending on the age of your child. And so we want ideally half the plate of fruits and or vegetables, a quarter of protein, which would include any kind of dairy or meat and alternative, and then a quarter of whole grains. And generally the drink choice should be water. Now for children, there is a bit of a kind of push for milk as well, up to about 2 cups per day at meals or snacks. But typically other than that, it should be water. And one of the big emphasis of the Canada's Food Guide is to aim for whole grains. So not just any grain product, but whole grains, which are higher in fiber. And for protein, there's also a push to try to incorporate more plant-based protein. So meat and fish can continue to be part of the diet, but of course trying as well maybe some legumes, some tofu, and maybe other soy or nut-based products. And so I've put some examples here, especially more kid-friendly, just to give you some ideas. So for example, on the left, I find are maybe more of typical lunches. But you can see, you know, if you're having yourself or the rest of your family's having a wrap, you could offer that maybe into smaller bite size to your child. And then trying again to aim for maybe a quarter of grain and whole grain from the wrap or tortilla, having some protein in there and some veggies and fruit as the other half. You can also make some fun shapes and sizes. So that can be one way to modify your family meal, like the pizza at the bottom left. Or you can take even leftover pasta, add some leftover chicken strips you have in the fridge, and again, fill the rest with veggies. So I'm finding that for children, these kind of boxes or Tupperwares can be really useful to make it fun and colorful, and to kind of separate things to make it a bit easier for you to aim for those different food groups. And then on the right-hand side, we see maybe more of a typical family dinner that would be modified for the child. And you can see there's some kind of grain, ideally whole grain, maybe some brown rice or some other type of grain like barley. You have some kind of meat filling about a quarter of the plate, and then you have half the plate of fruits and or vegetables. So typically if you kind of pick one option from each food group, it kind of makes up a meal. So that would be my big recommendation. Now in terms of snacks, I've put a couple of examples here, but basically what we typically recommend for a balanced snack is 2 food groups per snack. So if we think of a protein and a fruit, like yogurt and fruit as the first example, or it could be popcorn, which is considered a whole grain with maybe some fruit as well, or some cheese and some whole grain crackers. So I thought this image was really good visual, because you see the first row are kind of all grains, and the second row are all proteins, and the third row are all fruits and vegetables. So you can kind of combine, mix and match. So you could have, as I mentioned, kind of maybe popcorn and veggies, or, you know, nuts and banana, or so you can really mix and match, and it gives you a bunch of ideas. And you can also use things like that to help plan your snacks ahead and maybe involve the kids in figuring out some other snack ideas. Now, if we jump into the when, so when we should offer foods and what are the recommendations around that. So typically we want regular meal and snack time. So we want to stick to kind of a structure, something that the kid should kind of expect in terms of the times. And so typically we want to aim for 3 meals and about 2 to 3 snacks in between, especially by age 12, by 12 months or age 1. From 1 to pretty much like teenage adult years, we should be having about 3 meals with 2 to 3 snacks. And again, we choose when we offer it, and the child can always choose not to eat it, but then they're expected to not eat in between or drink anything nutritious like juice or milk in between. So we offer at those meal and snack times, and then if they don't want to eat, that's fine, but they have to understand, and we have to reiterate that they can't eat then until the next planned meal or snack. And so that's one of the big things that tends to help with stuff like picky eating or food refusal, just having your child understand that those are the times and that that's when they eat. Otherwise the kitchen is closed, and they'll start to get kind of on a routine, and it forces them to really use their hunger and fullness cues to guide their portions. And that's how we can trust that they're eating enough for their body's needs, and that they're going to grow into the body that they're meant to grow in. And then one of the recommendations too is to allow the child to stay at the table for at least 20 minutes. So, if your meal time, let's say your dinner time is around 6 p.m., if your child refuses to eat, then have them still sit at the table during that time, maybe for 20 minutes. And if they still don't want to eat after that, then they might be able to leave or stay till the end, but you can remove the food after about 20 minutes. It's just a good guide to follow. In terms of a typical day, what that might look like, so timing might vary. Typically, I'd say we could leave about 2 to 3 hours between each meal and snack, but it really depends on your family, your child. And then we would have kind of typical breakfast, lunch, dinner with some snacks in between. Again, portions will vary on your child, and they're the ones that should guide how much. But we can offer these types of food choices. Of course, this is just an example, but it's all examples that would be well balanced. So each food group you'll notice has each meal will have the 3 food groups, and then snacks will have at least 2 food groups. And now if we focus on the where, I think the most important thing for that is, of course, you want a place that's appropriate for eating. So ideally at the table, in a high chair, in the kitchen. And that goes for meals and snacks. So ideally trying to avoid just giving them the snack when they're kind of in front of the TV or while they're playing with a toy. You want a place that's specific to eating, and ideally eating together as much as possible is what the recommendation is right now. And like I said, trying to avoid any distractions. We want them to focus on the food, and that encourages them to focus on their hunger and fullness too. Of course, for younger children especially, we want to make sure we always supervise to try not to feed them like in their car seat or stroller as we're kind of walking. We want to make sure we supervise them, again, mostly for the risk of choking, but also for the risk of allergies when they're younger and you start to introduce foods. And then finally, just having a positive environment. So I think that kind of goes into the where, and what our role is as a parent caregiver is to create a positive environment around food so that they can feel safe, they develop healthy habits, and we act as role models, and so that's how they learn how to behave at the table and what behaviors are acceptable and which are not. And I think another point to keep in mind here too is to accept that there may be kind of messy meal times, especially if we think of younger children, they're playing with the food. It's important for them to feed themselves, and it's part of the learning process. And Hannah might have something to add around that, but I think often, we're used to, as adults, eating properly and keeping the place clean, but just understanding that kids can be a bit more messy and letting that happen as part of their development. And so I think that kind of covers the what, when, where. If you have any questions or more specific scenarios that you maybe struggle with, we can definitely discuss that. I've also shared some resources that are helpful. So the Canada's Food Guide has a section on tips for healthy eating, which goes for, there's a specific, I think, parenting and children section, but there's some tips for the whole family and just generally what kind of meals to offer, that kind of thing. Unlockfood.ca is also another really good resource. It's developed with the Dietitians of Canada, so it's evidence-based, and there's a lot of specific tricks on like picky eating, healthy eating, and then some tips too with children and what to do in certain scenarios. And then finally, the Ellen Satter Institute, it just goes a bit more into detail with the division of responsibility, which I spoke about at the beginning, and has other really helpful resources on what to do and what the parent or caregiver versus the child's responsibility is. And then these are the references I used. I can share the slides too if that's helpful, but I'll maybe just go back to that so you guys can have the resources on hand. I guess at this point, I'm just wondering, maybe Hannah has something to add, or if anyone has any questions, I am more than happy to go over them.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Now I'm gonna stop recording and to speed up the internet. If anyone have questions, you can just ask. So we'd like to answer that. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording.